In the heart of a restless continent, as storms of ambition and fear circled above the skies of Africa, a new voice began to rise from the dust, not with the echo of anger, but with the fire of awakening. For too long, the world had watched Africa through the eyes of others, its gold counted by foreign hands, its stories told in foreign tongues, its borders drawn by strangers who never walked its soil. But now, something different was unfolding. A leader, young and unyielding, stepped out of the silence. His name was Amari Traore, a soldier once, a thinker always, a man forged by the weight of injustice and the hunger for dignity. When the United Nations issued its so-called ultimatum, 14 days to comply, 14 days to bend, 14 days to remember who held the power, he stood before his people and the watching world and said calmly, "The days of kneeling are over." From that moment, Africa's story was no longer a whisper. It became thunder. Across villages and cities, across rivers that had carried pain for generations, a pulse began to beat, an invisible rhythm of defiance. Amari spoke not in the language of politics, but in the raw tone of truth, that no nation should live on its knees, that no child should inherit the humiliation of dependency. He spoke of fields that once fed the world, but now waited for permission to grow, of mines that dug up riches only to fill foreign vaults, of the silent cries of a continent rich in soul, but poor in power. Cameras from every major outlet pointed toward his small, landlocked nation, hoping to capture his collapse, but what they witnessed was rebirth. In his capital's narrow streets, men and women carried banners that read, "Our future is not for sale." The world's powerful nations called it rebellion. His people called it dignity. The ultimatum clock ticked, every second echoing like a heartbeat, but Amari refused to yield. He gathered his ministers, farmers, teachers, and soldiers, and said, "They want us to believe that the world belongs to those who print its money. But the world belongs to those who work its soil." With that, he announced a sweeping plan to reclaim national industries, to replace foreign troops with homegrown defense, and to build schools where children would learn the history written by their ancestors, not their colonizers. The air crackled with tension. Western diplomats flew in under the veil of diplomacy but left in quiet frustration, unable to bend a leader who refused to trade sovereignty for aid. Global headlines called him reckless. Local voices called him brave. Within days, neighboring nations began to stir, inspired by his defiance. They sent envoys not to lecture, but to learn. Across the continent, the idea of unity, once dismissed as a dream, started to feel like destiny. But every rise invites resistance. Shadowy interests began to move, whispering through boardrooms and embassies, plotting how to isolate his government, freeze its assets, and ignite internal dissent. Still, Amari stood firm, reminding his people that freedom was never given. It was taken. At night, in the flickering candlelight of his modest office, he would look over maps of the continent and see not lines of division, but veins of connection. A network of nations waiting to believe in themselves again. He knew the price of his defiance would be heavy. Threats came disguised as offers. Allies turned into spies. The media painted him as a tyrant, a dreamer, a danger. Yet he carried on, because somewhere beyond the noise, he heard something stronger, the heartbeat of a continent that refused to die. On the 14th day, when the world expected surrender, he appeared before the cameras, not with soldiers behind him, but with children beside him. "These are the ones you seek to control," he said softly, "but they will grow beyond your reach." His words cut deeper than any weapon. Markets trembled, and the halls of power whispered his name as if it were a warning. But for millions, it was a promise. The ultimatum expired, yet no bombs fell, no troops advanced, only silence. The uneasy kind that comes when empires realize they have lost control over a people's spirit. From that silence, Amari Traoré declared the birth of a new dawn. "We do not need permission to exist," he said. "We only need the courage to remember who we are." Across Africa, radios crackled with his speech, and for the first time in decades, the sound of hope outweighed the sound of fear. Farmers returned to their fields with pride. Youth painted murals of freedom on crumbling walls. Elders, who had seen colonizers come and go, smiled and said, "Perhaps this time we will not be betrayed." The UN held emergency meetings, trying to understand how defiance had spread faster than sanctions. The Western press called it chaos. African poets called it resurrection. And in that tension between power and purpose, a movement was born not of violence but of vision, not of vengeance but of victory. Amari Traoré became less a man and more a symbol, proof that even the smallest nation, when united by courage, can shake the largest empires.